Now we're on page 6 of the worksheet. What happens at the death of the first spouse? If you're a single person, you would skip over this part of the worksheet. But at the death of the first spouse, the property in the trust, a joint revocable trust, splits in half if everything is community or joint. But what really goes is half of the community, half of the joint property for the survivor goes here, and all the survivor's separate property goes to one side of the equation, and same with the decedent. The decedent has a choice of whether to leave everything on his or her side to the spouse in the survivor's trust, later going down to beneficiaries they designate, or whether to lock it up in irrevocable trusts to more control the assets. We see this a lot in blended families. When they lock up their share in irrevocable trusts, they still let the survivor typically have access, either just the income generated by the trust or trusts, or distributions for income and principal for health, education, maintenance, support before it drops down to these beneficiaries below. This side locks it up. There's added complexity. We have to get taxpayer ID numbers for these irrevocable trusts. There's tax returns due every year for the income generated by these trusts. So you have to balance the complexity involved with the control or the simplicity with lack of control. Because the survivor, if you just leave everything to the survivor, can change the ultimate distribution. So
if the survivor were to remarry, the survivor could leave everything to another spouse and not have it go to anybody here. So that's why this whole issue of control and whether we want to make sure, whether the decedent wants to make sure that this property ultimately passes to their children or his or her children at the first death.
When you want a lot of control, some spouses even put different trustees over these B and C trusts. Typically, you'll see the most common type of plan in the past was always an A, B, C trust like this, where the surviving spouse was the trustee of these trusts. But if you want a lot of control, you can actually put different people in charge of these trusts, not the surviving spouse. So it's really a decision of how much control you want, how much simplicity you want. But a lot of this complexity, long-term married couples don't appreciate this complex situation.
So long-term married couples would typically leave the property to the survivor's trust with a potential disclaimer if it was desired for asset protection purposes or possibly tax planning purposes to go to the B and C type trusts. And so on your sheet, if you wanted to go outright to the surviving spouse in this trust with the potential for a disclaimer, that's the default. That's what most couples will do. If you're interested in having this control after the first death over this trust to make sure it goes ultimately to these beneficiaries, that's where you'd mark the second box and identify whether you want income only or income in principal and have that property go down in this way to the children.
And there's also, you can, even if you lock it up on this side and let's say you have kids from a joint marriage, you can give what you would call the survivor a power of appointment to change it up among these beneficiaries if a child goes bad and things like that, but not let them change it completely. That's called a power of appointment, a limited power of appointment. But typically when we're designing this trust, what's going to populate this B trust is the exemption amount, the exemption that you can pass free of estate tax. The decedent has $5.25 million and the survivor has $5.25 million. So that's what would populate up to $5.25 million in the decedent's trust. Anything over that on the decedent's side would, if they want control, would populate the Q-tip trust.
Most states aren't that large. And so it would end up, if you'd have a segment that would be under the control or not under the control. Yeah. Typically, we would just go with the survivor's trust with a potential disclaimer to these. And next, we'll talk about what happens with this distribution as it heads down to the children.